Now, as Nigeria plans to review its import policy on staple food items, Ada Osakwe, the CEO at Agrolay Ventures, joins me now to discuss how best to build Nigeria's agricultural value chain. Ada, thank you so much for coming in today. It's great to speak to you. So, first of all, just your thoughts about where we are at. Everyone has talked in very positive terms about the gains from the last administration in terms of agriculture. Yeah. But in terms of trying to build a really strong value chain that would drive investments, that will really take it, like the former minister used to say, from just farming to a business. Yes. So your thoughts about the next critical steps, given what we've achieved over the last 4 years?
I think, thanks for having me. I do think over the past 4 years, we definitely had a big focus on value chains for agriculture. Not many people were saying that phrase 4 years ago, but now it just rolls off everyone's tongue. Because really, we had to really think critically, how do we take care of those linkages from the farm to the table, to the end user, and add value across the board. Right. So I do believe that over the last 4 years, there was a big focus on fixing those chains that were broken, because it causes inefficiencies if you don't have those linkages. But then as we go forward, we need to solidify those gains. Right. So you talk about value chains starting from inputs of the seedlings that you mentioned earlier, then you move on to transportation, logistics, you move on to processing, which we'll speak a little bit about today, and then of course the retailers and the end users, to the farmers, to the person's table. So I think going forward, in my personal view, there needs to be a stronger focus on the processing, because we cannot continue spending a trillion naira yearly, annually, importing food. And it's a huge sector. The packaged food industry, which is a great proxy for processed foods, is estimated globally to be about $2 trillion worth. And we're not even touching that and getting the value from that. We're leaving it to others. Right.
I think you make a very interesting point about processing, because if you speak to many farmers, they will tell you that a lot of what they produce actually rots. It never gets to the market. So how best do we tackle that? Do we need to find ways to attract investors? What exactly is the way forward?
So the last 4 years, that's what I was more or less focused on, trying to attract those investors. We got about $5 billion of committed capital to doing more of the agribusiness, the processing of that, of the produce. So it's not enough to be the largest.
Crops in particular?
It's across the chain, because it's not enough to be the largest producer of tomatoes in Africa, or the largest producer of pineapples in Africa, or the second largest producer of citrus fruits in the world. It's not enough if we're not turning that comparative advantage into a competitive advantage for us. So I take tomatoes, for example. 65% of the farmers in West Africa who farm tomatoes are Nigerian. So we're talking about the Kadawa Valley in the Kano area. But then you're producing all of this, but 60% of it goes to waste, like you mentioned, just because of poor storage, or bad logistics in terms of the way they transport the tomatoes, and just no markets, immediate markets to add value to it in terms of processing. So what do we do? As you look at the economics of that tomato value chain, let's start with the farmer. He captures only 1%, from the research we did, 1% of the value. Then you move on to the aggregator, who captures about 3% of the value. Then you go to the transporter, who captures 4% of the value. And then you move to the processor, who does the tomato paste that we use, and they capture 55% of the value. And then you go on to the retailer, the ShopRites and Co., who capture 37% before it gets to the consumer. So yes, you might say, wow, that's a great investment opportunity. I want to be in that 55% bracket and process tomatoes, tomato paste. But today, 95% of the tomato paste that we consume is imported.
So why aren't we processing? Is it infrastructure?
So exactly.
What
back to the value chains. We're talking here about building value chains. There are inefficiencies. So anybody wants to be able to maximize value across the chain, but at the least cost. Right now, Nigeria's costs are too high. So yes, infrastructure you mentioned is very critical to ensuring that. But at the same time, when you talk about policies, because you step back, even within the ecosystem of a chain, of a value chain, you need, and you're building that chain, but you need the right foundation to build anything. And you need, the foundation is good policy. So if you have policies that are not in favor of domestic production, because you're allowing a lot of imports to come into the country, you can never get your domestic investors to move forward. So it's kind of interesting to see the direction the government's going now. I was using the example of tomato paste. It's on the CBN's list that's limited the forex.
You think that's a good idea?
I think going forward, it's the only way that we can go if we want to stem the tide of just spending so much on food importation. I believe agricultural crops accounted for over 30% of the list of 40. So that says something, that we really have to look inwards,
right.
And use the talent. And
okay, let's talk a bit about, we talked about how the government can support. So,
yeah.
I mean, one of the policies that came up with under additional was crop processing zones.
Yes.
Now, how do we make the most of that in terms of getting the infrastructure right, for us to add value to agricultural products in Nigeria?
I really love the idea of the staple crop processing zones, what we call SCPZs.
Yeah.
Dr. Adesina liked all the different acronyms. So we definitely, that really was focused on creating spaces, ecosystems in areas of high food production, where the government would contribute to upgrading infrastructure, so proper water, proper power, which processors obviously need. But because you're in an area where there's high food production, you can easily source your raw materials, so the inputs and the feedstock that is going in. So it sounds like a perfect idea.
Right.
And I do think that it's definitely one that we can use to when we think about economic prosperity and changing the lives of farmers. You're creating ready markets for those farmers who are in the area, who can go right from their farm gate and sell their produce to the processor, and that processor can take it. And what's great is that you can also, as you think about the value chain and those linkages, strengthening it is important, because I don't want that farmer to keep getting only 1% of the value of tomatoes while someone else is getting 55%. Let's increase the size of the pie and ensure that there's value spread equitably across the board.
But we can still focus on this crop processing zones for a bit now. What do we need the government to do? It's going to cost some money, I guess, to create the infrastructure that would really endear the investors. So does this have to be a big part of the agriculture budget going forward, in your view?
It does, but I don't want us to rely on the budget. Dr. Adesina was very focused on ensuring we looked at public-private partnerships, ensuring that we made bankable projects and made it make sense to show the value, so that private sector is the one who comes in and says, this is a clear case, I can make money, let's make it happen. So in the same way with the staple crop processing zones, we're working with the African Development Bank, we had pitched the idea to a few other DFIs to support, and even the ADB actually did take it through to their board, and they had started supporting the areas around the zone with a view to putting out a second tranche towards the core infrastructure of investing in the first zone, which is in Kogi State.
Right.
That's the first one we're going to use as more or less a pilot case.
Well, we look
so
forward
yes,
to
we
that.
still need the government.
And hopefully the fact that Adesina is now ADB president could help that process. Okay, but let's talk about another bit of the problem here. Transport, storage.
Yes.
To me, it really does sound like a great opportunity, because we just mentioned earlier, quite a bit of what is produced actually rots. Yes. So if someone invests in storage and transport, it sounds like a no-brainer in terms of investments, but are we getting that investment coming to that area now?
Not enough. Not enough, because even as I'm saying this now, I'm sure somebody is
do you think we're not getting enough because people don't
They're not aware.
They're not aware
yes,
of
so that's what I'm saying. Even as I'm sitting down here, I'm sure somebody is sitting and saying, wow, is that really the case in agriculture? I should be looking more seriously. So that's what we found or at least personally I've found over the last few years. There's a lack of an awareness of the opportunity to go into these various components of that value chain, where you can plug in as an investor and actually become a billionaire or more. So yes, I do personally, in terms of my investment thesis, I do personally like the logistics space. I'm actually invested in a company that does logistics. And
how's that going?
It's fine. It didn't start off obviously as a food investment case. But my view was that with time they would see the value in maybe bringing in those tomatoes that are rotting in the Kadara Valley and ship it down, rather than us having the fluctuations of prices down out here in the south when it's not tomato season. But now they're actually even going, in the last few months, they started going into food delivery, and very soon, hopefully, I feel they go into that perishable side of the food business.
Well,
yes.
It's quite exciting to hear that someone's invested in agriculture and, of course, the transport value and storage value chain. Sounds quite interesting. Well, all the best as you do that. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you,
We've been
Wale.
speaking to Ada Osakwe, CEO at Agrolay Ventures.